Have you ever wondered if your landlord can just raise your rent whenever they want? It's a common concern for many renters, especially when budgets are tight and moving isn't easy. In this video, we'll break down when and how a landlord can legally increase your rent, what protections tenants have, and what steps you can take if you receive a rent hike notice. Let's start by understanding the basics of rental agreements and the laws that govern rent increases. First, let's talk about rental agreements. Most tenants sign either a fixed-term lease or a month-to-month agreement. A fixed-term lease usually lasts for a set period, like 1 year, and locks in your rent for that time. On the other hand, a month-to-month agreement renews every month, giving both you and your landlord more flexibility. The type of agreement you have plays a big role in when and how your rent can be increased. If you have a fixed-term lease, your landlord generally cannot raise your rent until the lease expires. The rent amount is set in the lease, and both parties are bound by that agreement. This means you have predictable housing costs for the duration of the lease. However, once the lease term ends, your landlord may propose a new rent amount if you choose to renew. With a month-to-month rental agreement, landlords have more flexibility to raise the rent. However, they can't just do it overnight. Most states require landlords to provide written notice before increasing rent, often 30 days in advance. This gives tenants time to decide whether to accept the new rent or make other arrangements. Notice requirements for rent increases vary by state and sometimes by city. Typically, landlords must give at least 30 days written notice for a rent increase in a month-to-month tenancy. In some places, longer notice may be required if the increase is significant or if the tenant has lived in the unit for a long time. Always check your local laws for the specific rules that apply to your situation. Landlords are usually required to provide notice of a rent increase in writing. This can be delivered by mail, email, or even hand-delivered, depending on local laws and your lease agreement. Verbal notice is rarely sufficient. Keeping a copy of any written notice is important for both landlords and tenants in case of disputes. Some cities and states have rent control laws that limit how much and how often landlords can raise rent. These laws are designed to protect tenants from sudden or excessive increases. If you live in a rent-controlled area, your landlord must follow strict rules about rent hikes, and there may be a cap on the percentage increase allowed each year. Rent control is not universal. It typically applies in certain cities with high housing demand, like New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. If you're unsure whether your rental is covered by rent control, check with your local housing authority or city government. Knowing your rights can help you respond appropriately to a rent increase notice. Not all properties are covered by rent control, even in cities where these laws exist. Newer buildings, single-family homes, and certain types of housing may be exempt. Landlords of exempt properties can usually raise rent as allowed by state law, but they still must provide proper notice. A few states, like California and Oregon, have statewide rent caps that limit how much landlords can increase rent each year, even outside of traditional rent control areas. These caps are usually tied to inflation or a set percentage. If you live in one of these states, your landlord must follow these rules. In areas without rent control or rent caps, there is often no legal limit on how much a landlord can raise rent as long as they provide proper notice. However, in competitive markets, landlords may be limited by what tenants are willing to pay. In rent-controlled or capped areas, the maximum increase is set by law. Landlords can only raise rent at certain times depending on your lease. For fixed-term leases, increases usually happen at renewal. For month-to-month agreements, increases can happen after proper notice. Sudden or mid-lease increases are generally not allowed unless specified in your lease agreement. When your fixed-term lease ends, your landlord may offer a renewal with a new rent amount. You can choose to accept the new terms, negotiate, or move out. If you stay without signing a new lease, your tenancy may convert to month, and different rules for rent increases may apply. Some rent increases are illegal. For example, a landlord cannot raise your rent in retaliation for you reporting a problem or exercising your legal rights. Discriminatory rent increases based on race, gender, or other protected characteristics are also prohibited by law. If you complain about repairs or report code violations, your landlord cannot legally raise your rent as punishment. This is known as a retaliatory rent increase and is prohibited in most states. If you suspect retaliation, you may have legal grounds to challenge the increase. Landlords are also forbidden from raising rent based on a tenant's race, religion, gender, family status, or other protected categories. This is considered discrimination and violates federal and state fair housing laws. If you believe a rent increase is discriminatory, you can file a complaint with the appropriate agency. The process for raising rent usually starts with a written notice from the landlord. The notice should state the new rent amount, the date it takes effect, and any other relevant details. Tenants then have the option to accept the new rent, negotiate, or give notice to move out. If you receive a rent increase notice, You don't have to accept it right away. You can try negotiating with your landlord, especially if you have a good payment history or if similar units in the area are renting for less. Sometimes landlords are willing to compromise to keep reliable tenants. After receiving a rent increase notice, review your lease and local laws to ensure the increase is legal. If everything checks out, decide whether to accept the new rent, negotiate, or move out. Respond to your landlord in writing to document your decision. If you decide not to accept the rent increase, you may need to give your landlord notice that you plan to move out. The required notice period is usually outlined in your lease or local law, often 30 days. Make sure to provide written notice and keep a copy for your records. If you believe a rent increase is illegal or unfair, you can challenge it. Start by talking to your landlord and explaining your concerns. If that doesn't work, you may be able to file a complaint with a local housing authority or seek legal advice. Whenever you deal with rent increases, it's important to keep detailed records. Save copies of notices, emails, and any correspondence with your landlord. Documentation can be crucial if you need to challenge an increase or resolve a dispute later. A landlord cannot evict you just to raise the rent, especially during a fixed-term lease. However, if you refuse to pay the new rent after proper notice, the landlord may start eviction proceedings. Always communicate and try to resolve issues before they escalate. Generally, landlords cannot raise your rent during a fixed-term lease unless the lease specifically allows it. Some leases have clauses for increases due to property taxes or other costs. Always read your lease carefully to understand your obligations. Some leases have automatic renewal clauses, which can affect when and how rent is increased. If your lease automatically renews, the landlord may include a rent increase in the renewal terms. Make sure you understand these clauses before signing. Even in areas without rent control, some states have laws that limit how often rent can be increased, such as only once every 12 months. These laws are designed to prevent frequent, disruptive changes for tenants. Check your state's regulations for details. Sometimes, landlords may raise rent after making significant improvements to the property, like renovations or new amenities. In rent-controlled areas, there are usually rules about how much rent can be increased for improvements. Tenants should be notified in advance. If your landlord pays for utilities and those costs go up, they may try to pass some of the increase onto you through higher rent. Whether this is allowed depends on your lease and local laws. Always check your agreement to see how utilities are handled. In subsidized or government-assisted housing, rent increases are strictly regulated. Landlords must follow federal, state, and local rules, and increases are often tied to changes in income or program guidelines. Tenants in these programs have special protections. If you rent a space in a mobile home park, there may be special rules about rent increases. Many states have laws that require longer notice periods or limit how much rent can go up. Always check the specific regulations for mobile home parks in your area. Student housing often operates on academic year leases, with rent set for the term. Increases usually happen between terms, not during the lease. If you're in student housing, check your agreement for details about when and how rent can change. Short-term rentals, like vacation homes or month-to-month stays, often have more flexible pricing. Landlords can usually adjust rent between stays, but must still follow any applicable notice requirements if the rental is extended. Rules for rent increases can differ between commercial and residential properties. Commercial leases often allow for more frequent or larger increases, while residential tenants have more legal protections. Always know which type of lease you have. During the COVID-19 pandemic, some areas put temporary bans or limits on rent increases to help tenants facing financial hardship. These emergency measures may have expired, but it's worth checking if any protections are still in place where you live. A rent increase is separate from late fees. If you pay rent late, your landlord may charge a late fee as allowed by your lease. However, they can't increase your rent as a penalty for late payment unless your agreement specifically allows it. If your rent increases, your landlord may also ask for a higher security deposit. State laws often limit how much a landlord can require for a deposit, usually a multiple of the monthly rent. Any increase in deposit must comply with these limits. If you share your rental with roommates, a rent increase affects the total rent for the unit. How you split the new amount is up to your agreement with your roommates. Make sure everyone is aware of the change and update your payment arrangements as needed. If you have a pet, your landlord may charge a pet fee or increase rent to cover potential damages. Any changes must be outlined in your lease and comply with local laws. Service animals are usually exempt from extra charges. Sometimes, landlords may increase rent if they add new amenities, like a gym or laundry room. In rent-controlled areas, there may be rules about how much rent can go up for added amenities. Tenants should be notified in advance and given the option to use the new features. Landlords cannot raise your rent just because you request repairs or maintenance. Rent increases must follow legal procedures and cannot be used as retaliation. If repairs lead to significant improvements, different rules may apply. Some landlords require tenants to have renter's insurance, but they cannot raise your rent just because you get or use insurance. Any changes to rent must follow legal procedures and be properly documented. If you violate your lease, such as by having unauthorized occupants or pets, your landlord may take action, but they cannot simply raise your rent as punishment. Lease violations are usually handled through warnings or eviction, not rent increases. If you're unsure about your rights or need help with a rent increase, there are many resources available. Local tenant unions, legal aid organizations, and housing authorities can provide guidance and support. Don't hesitate to reach out if you need assistance. To sum up, landlords cannot raise rent anytime they want. The rules depend on your lease type, local and state laws, and whether your property is covered by rent control or caps. Always review your lease, know your rights, and keep records of any notices or communications. If you face a rent increase, you have options and protections. Understanding when and how a landlord can raise your rent is crucial for every tenant. By staying informed and proactive, you can protect your housing stability and respond confidently to any changes. Remember, knowledge is your best defense in the rental market. Thanks for watching, and stay empowered as a renter.